Well, thank you very much. I am delighted to be here. Uh, this is this is a little risky, but I think I can trust you people with a story that I really love, because I am very interested in men and women and the differences between us, which do exist, by the way. Um, and uh, and I love this story about a man in his middle age, and he decides he needs to get in shape. So he goes to his gym and he speaks to the gym manager and says, do you have anything that'll build up my shoulders and make me sort of, more impressive? Yes, absolutely. He takes him over to this machine. You should do that. Good. I think I also need to get rid of this paunch. You have anything to do that? Well, I think you need some cardio for that. He takes him over to the cardio machine. And the guy's working out. And then at that point, this beautiful woman walks in, just stunningly gorgeous. And everybody looks at her, and the man who's trying to get in shape sidles over to the manager and he says, do you have a machine here that would make a woman like that look at a man like me? And the owner says, oh yeah, and he walks him over to the ATM. Well, I'm here today to talk about men because it's one of my favorite subjects. I love men, and it's a good thing that I do because life has conspired to surround me with them. I have 2 brothers, I'm married to a man, and we have 3 sons. Now, raising 3 boys taught me important life lessons. That snakes and other reptiles really aren't so bad when you come right down to it. That trips to the emergency room can enliven an otherwise dull weekend, and that sorting laundry into darks and lights is a fool's game. But in all seriousness, men are ailing in our time, and it's a subject that is sorely neglected in our public discourse. The needs and challenges of women get the lion's share of attention. We are reminded almost daily of women's accomplishments in all fields of endeavor, from business to sports to law and medicine, and we are urged to redouble our efforts to solidify these gains and to rally against the last obstacles to women's success, like the glass ceiling and so forth. Now, I have my doubts about the glass ceiling, but that's a topic for another day. Today, I want to focus on what is happening to men and boys. We have an underreported crisis in missing men. Men are missing from the workforce, from family life, and even from the military. A 2017 Pentagon report found that 71% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 24 are ineligible to serve in our armed forces. The main reasons are poor health, which includes mental health, lack of physical fitness, inadequate education, or criminal records. Boys are doing worse in school than girls. They are more likely to fall behind, more likely to be discipline problems, and more likely to drop out of high school than girls. Girls also get better grades, and a whopping 70% of high school valedictorians are female. Women now earn 60%, consistent with the data from North Carolina. Women now earn 60% of the nation's master's degrees, about half of all law and medical degrees, and 60% of all bachelor's degrees. In a stark reversal since the 1970s, men are now more likely than women to hold only a high school diploma. So many more qualified young women than men are applying to colleges that admissions officers are practicing quiet affirmative action for males. They don't want their freshman classes to be lopsidedly female, so admissions officers put their thumb on the scale for male applicants. Being male, according to one study, raises the chance of college acceptance by from 6.5 to 9 points. Women today hold a majority of the nation's jobs, including 51.4% of managerial and professional jobs, which is up from 26.1 in 1980. And it goes on and on. 54% of all accountants, half of all banking and insurance jobs, 45% of associates in law firms, and those numbers are rising steeply. Now, on the other side of the coin, diseases of despair, alcoholism, drug abuse, and suicide have dramatically increased over the past generation for both sexes, but more for men. So many men are dying from these woes that the overall life expectancy in the U.S. has now declined for 3 straight years after increasing without exception every year since the Great Flu Epidemic of 1919. Though it has ticked down in the past 2 years, the U.S. continues to have among the highest incarceration rates in the world. Most surveys put the U.S. at the very top of the world in terms of incarceration, but I don't trust those data because they include reports from countries like Cuba and China who are not trustworthy, to put it mildly. But 93% of the inmates in America's prisons are male. The past 3 or 4 years have witnessed strong economic growth and job creation. Yet, if you look closely at the numbers, you'll find that it is women, not men, who are disproportionately filling those positions. The December 2018 jobs report, for example, found that a healthy 312,000 workers had been added to the employment rolls, and wages are rising. But here's something you probably have not heard. About 60% of those jobs have been filled by women. Men have been withdrawing from the labor force altogether for several decades now. If you look at a graph of what's called male labor force participation, you find that it's a pretty straight downward arrow. Men in the prime of their lives, that is between the ages of 25 and 54, are more likely to be out of work now than at the end of the Great Depression. In 2017, 22% of prime-age males were out of the workforce. So let me be clear. We're not talking about unemployed men. We are talking about men who are not in the workforce and are not looking for work. This is 7 million men. They are getting by on a combination of disability payments and living with family members who either have earned income or who are themselves receiving government assistance. As Nick Eberstadt of the American Enterprise Institute has shown, the men who are withdrawing from the workforce have certain traits in common. They tend to be native-born and unmarried. They tend to have a high school diploma or less, and not an insignificant percentage do have criminal records. So what is happening to men in America? A number of explanations have been offered. A popular interpretation points to the decline in manufacturing employment. Others have cited the expansion of disability programs, and these doubtless play a role. But it's not a total explanation. As a share of total employment, manufacturing has declined steadily for 3 generations, from 33% in 1947 to 8% in 2015. And yet, if the lack of manufacturing jobs were the whole reason that men were joining the ranks of the unworking, you'd think that every single one of those jobs that still exists today would be filled and that there would be waiting lists for replacements. And yet, that is not the case. Thousands of high-paying manufacturing jobs are going begging. And it's estimated that 2.4 million manufacturing jobs may go unfilled in the next 10 years due to a shortage of labor. And sectors even beyond manufacturing are also hurting for workers. Many employers who are offering low-skill jobs in trucking, agriculture, hotels and restaurants, and even Silicon Valley are having trouble finding workers. Well, Ecclesiastes taught us that there is nothing new under the sun. But I submit that the current decline in men's fortunes is something new in human history. After millennia of men being the first sex, the more dominant, the more powerful, and the more respected, men have slipped into lesser status. Every profession has women's support groups. Every HR department has a division to handle women's needs, from flex time to maternity leave, and that's fine. But no special programs are available to men. They are assumed to be the leaders and the privileged, even as they fall further and further behind. Adding insult to injury, feminists decry what they call toxic masculinity, and many young women, especially on college campuses, are socialized to believe that men are inherently flawed. In 2014, the leader of New Zealand's Labour Party actually said, "I am sorry for being a man." Whereas in China and India, parents abuse ultrasound technology to choose male offspring, In the US today, more expectant parents, both mothers and fathers, express a preference for a girl over a boy. Only 49% of Democrats in a recent Pew poll said that looking up to masculine men is a good thing for society. I submit that men and boys are suffering today because the changes in family life in the past 50 years have hurt boys more than girls. As a consequence of the sexual revolution and the feminist movement, traditional mother-father families have become much less common than in the past. Whereas in 1965, I hope that's not my phone, might be, sorry. Whereas in 1965, the white non-marital birth rate was 3.4%. It had risen to 35.7% by 2014. And the rates for African Americans rose from 24% in 65 to 73% in 2014. Now, most discussions of changing family patterns focus on women, the plight of single mothers, their need for affordable childcare, and so forth. And there is no doubt that raising children as a single parent is extremely difficult. Vast majority of single parents are women. But what we are slow to grapple with as a society is that the rise of fatherlessness is at the heart of many of the social ills we are attributing, I think, to other causes. Some have pointed to college-educated men and noticed that they tend not to suffer from the issues afflicting those without a college degree. And they've concluded that perhaps it's the college that's the secret. But here's an alternative perspective. The decline of families has not hit all segments of society equally. College-educated men and women are following a life plan that has been labeled the success sequence. That is, they get educated, get a job, and get married, and only then have children. About 91% of college-educated women are married before they give birth to their first child. The pattern for those with less than a college degree is very different. They fall into relationships early in their lives. They have babies, sometimes complete a year of college, sometimes not, sometimes get jobs, sometimes not, and struggle to stay on an even keel. The rate of unwed parenting for high school dropouts is 67%. The retreat from marriage has come to define the poor and the middle class, while the upper third, the college-educated, live by entirely different mores. And it turns out that stable marriage is the great dividing line in our society. As much as money, the advantage that college-educated parents give to their children is themselves. They give the great gift of two parents. We focus a lot on income inequality, and money is, of course, important, but it's not as important as parents. Children from low-income two-parent families outperform students from high-income single-parent families. We know from a wealth of social science literature that growing up in a two-parent household has tremendous effects on child welfare. Girls who grow up with two parents are less likely to live in poverty, to be depressed, to have body image problems, to abuse drugs or alcohol, to have an out-of-wedlock child, and to drop out of school. Girls who grow up with their fathers girls who grow up without their fathers are much less safe. Children in homes with a non-relative adult are 11 times more likely to be the victims of physical, sexual, or emotional abuse than those living with their biological or adoptive parents. And children in homes with a non-relative adult male are 50 times more likely to die of inflicted injuries than those who grow up with their biological parents. Girls who have involved fathers are more self-assured and happier than girls who grow up without their dads. For boys, believe it or not, the differences are even more profound. Fatherless boys fill our juvenile detention centers, where they represent 70% of inmates. They also dominate drug abuse facilities. When economists from MIT studied children born in Florida between 1992 and 2002, they found that for children raised by two parents, there were few differences between the sexes. But for children raised in single-mother homes, the boys did significantly worse on a range of measures. As the study authors wrote, Growing up in a single-parent home appears to significantly decrease the probability of college attendance for boys, but has no similar effect for girls. Fatherless boys are less ambitious, less hopeful, and more likely to get into trouble at school than fatherless girls, unquote. These men who grow up without fathers are also much less likely to be seen as marriageable when they come of age. Women are more likely than men to list having a steady job as an important trait in a potential spouse, and fatherless men are also much more likely to have drug and alcohol problems, anger issues, and poor self-control than those who grow up with their dads. These are generalities and obviously do not apply to every individual. Many men raised by single mothers turn out fine, but the overall picture is troubling. It turns out that when women raise children without fathers, they have trouble raising the kind of men that other women will want to marry. We badly need to relearn the importance of marriage and fatherhood. Men are not just valuable risk takers, entrepreneurs, soldiers, scholars, and assembly line workers, though all of those are great. They play an indispensable role as fathers. Their natural style of parenting, more playful than moms, more demanding, and more limit-setting, turns out to be exactly what children, and especially boys, need to become fully rounded adults. Thank you. Well, I'll say this. It is interesting that this problem of boys growing up without their dads is worse in the United States than in any other developed country. You often hear that marriage has collapsed in countries like Scandinavia. And that is true as a formal matter. But when you look at how people actually raise their kids, they do tend to stay, couples stay together. And even though they're not married, they are lifelong partners for the most part. They have a higher rate of divorce, of course, than they used to have, and they have a higher rate of unwed parenting than, say, in 1950. But it is a very starkly different picture from what we have. Americans have the dubious distinction of the least stable adult relationships in the world and in the developed world, and it's a multifaceted causal thing, I would say. I do not let the feminists off the hook because I think that they mistakenly derided family life. They felt that it was a trap for women and that it was bad for women to be married. And so they participated in a tendency in our society to devalue it, to say that it didn't matter. And so that was part of it. And the other part was the sexual revolution, which said that the most important thing in life is your own personal gratification, and that all rules or standards about how you ought to behave in this realm are antique and outmoded, and that we should get rid of them. And they also told us that it didn't really matter, that a piece of paper was irrelevant to your romantic life, that after all, love was all that mattered. And that turned out to be a little over-optimistic.
Yes, okay, so one would predict if men are leaving the family like this and so forth, and that this is accelerated in the past 20 years, you would expect to see an increase in violent crime since those who grow up without fathers are more prone to violent crime. But we've seen exactly the reverse. What do you think is the cause of that?
Right, so it's really interesting, the reduction in violent crime in our society. And I will confess that 25 years ago, I believed with many people, many conservatives, that the drop in crime that we saw in the 1990s was attributable to police um, tactics such as Rudy Giuliani introduced, broken windows theory. I was a great believer in broken windows theory. Um, but since then, I've come to have some doubts about that because the drop in crime happened not just in New York and not even just in the United States. It happened everywhere. It happened in Canada. It happened in places that adopted broken windows policing and community policing, and in places that didn't. And so I am open to other explanations of what caused the reduction in crime. Um,
How about
certainly,
cameras everywhere?
well, cameras is that was just what I was going to get to. It does seem to coincide. First of all, we did go on a binge of incarcerating people. So you take people take criminals off the street, that reduces your crime rate right there. But also, but it isn't just the fact that we've incarcerated so many people. Arrest rates are down too, and but the drop does seem to coincide, and this isn't proof, but it is an interesting association. It does seem to coincide with the ubiquity of cell phones and cell phones with cameras. So maybe that's part of it. I don't know the explanation, but I find it intriguing.
You described a big, serious, scary problem. Isn't there a government program?
Yeah, not only is there a government program, but it will be inexpensive, and Mexico will pay for it. No, wait, I got that wrong. Millionaires and billionaires will pay for it, according to Elizabeth Warren. Look, this is a huge problem, and it is not amenable to government solutions alone, although I do think there are certain aspects of the problem that government can help, mostly by not doing things that are causing the problem, by reforming some of the ways that we, for example, give out disability payments. I think we could tighten that up considerably, make it a little less easy for people to qualify. A lot of the people who are getting disability these days are getting it because they have back pain or something very nonspecific. I think that might be one way, but I do think this requires something much broader than government programs or even government ceasing to do harm. It requires a cultural shift and a recognition that we need to roll back the assumptions that families don't matter.
I was just going to say, is there a correlation, because I think there is, you studied this, is there a correlation between something as obvious as church attendance and family structure? Because it seems to me a lot fewer people go to church, and the churches, a lot of them have decided to adopt what had previously been considered heresies in order to remain popular, and all of these things have, in my view, conspired to abase marriage, along with the movement for, thanks to Justice Kennedy, for homo matrimony. I think all of these things have abased the institution. So do you see a correlation between this stuff?
Absolutely. There is a link with falling church attendance, but interestingly, for decades now, the churches have been soft-pedaling marriage. They have been, they have tried to be popular, as you suggest, and not to be too demanding. And I do find it interesting that the churches that are not losing membership are the ones that have held the line and are still giving some meaty substance to worshipers rather than kind of the thin gruel of, just anything goes. And so, yeah, but there are lots of very interesting data which I came across in my research about Black and Hispanic men who are church attenders and how incredibly well they're doing in our society on every measure. First of all, they tend to be married. They overwhelmingly tend to be employed. They don't have drug and alcohol problems. It's just amazing. And these things are just the basics of life, right? You need a community, and a church helps to provide that. You need a community that reinforces the values you're trying to teach your children. in that sense, and only in that sense, Hillary Clinton was right in the title of her book. It does take a village. It's, if you're a conservative or whatever, and you're trying to, or a hippie, whatever, if you're trying to raise children with certain values, you can't do it all by yourself. You need a community that will reinforce those things. Anyway, those are the things that strong churches reinforce. And how you get back to that, one thing I would suggest, not an area of expertise, but I would suggest that the churches not try to move toward the culture, that they try to move against it and see. That might work better. They should be countercultural.
So like we've seen since like the 70s and 80s a lot of judicial activism to actually like increase men's rights or protections for men in the workplace, like paternity leave after pregnancy and things like that. Do you think that leads to stronger male influences in the home and incentives to keep fathers around, or do you think that's counterintuitive?
Well, it's I have no problem with it in principle. If employers want to give paternity leave as well as maternity leave, it's fine with me. I have to tell you that as somebody who had 3 children, fathers aren't that useful in the beginning. I'm sorry. It's just they don't know how to do it. And now, of course, some are great, but there's a lot of really interesting data from. I'll tell you one more quick thing. Jean Kirkpatrick told me when I was first having little kids, and her children were grown at that point, but she said, and she also had 3 boys, and she said, yeah, in the beginning, in those early years, their kids are all about mom. They want their mom, and it's really. She said, and then they get to middle school age, and suddenly dad is like God, and it just happens. So that was an interesting perception. So maybe dads should get the paternity leave when the kids are older. But in any event, I don't have a problem with people giving, with companies giving paternity leave, but I will point to data from the Scandinavian countries where they're nothing if not ambitious social engineers, and they want to remake exactly how people do everything. And so Denmark, Sweden, and Norway have introduced one government-mandated program after another to try to get parents to take equal amounts of parental leave. And so, it started with offering it to men, and then not enough men were taking it up, and then it went to, okay, we'll give you a bonus if you take the paternal, and they went through a whole series of steps, and they never could get it to the point where equal numbers of men and women were choosing to take the paternity leave. Moreover, they found that when men did take the paternity leave, their wives were still doing the majority of the child care. So, it's tough to remake human nature.
As you spoke, it just 25 years ago or so, Christina Hoff Sommers wrote War Against Boys, and it just in my mind harkened back to that book, and it makes that book seem very predictive. And I'm wondering if you see that, and what the connections are between what you're doing and what Christina did 25 years ago.
Yeah. No, Christina's a friend and does great work, and this is a follow-on to that. If anything, it's become even more dire in the past 25 years.
Back in the 1990s, I was active with the Charen Chamber of Commerce, and we started an education division where we wanted business people to help the school system educate kids. So we did a good bit of mentoring. We started business alliances. We did a lot of things with the school, and I enjoyed doing that, as a matter of fact. But I made an observation that, in fact, a middle school principal said to me, it's really interesting that a lot of our boys are on Ritalin, and we're administering that Ritalin to try to make boys act like girls.
Mm-hmm.
And it was absolutely true. I remember observing the fact that the girls in classes were much smarter than boys were back then and participating,
Mm-hmm.
where the boys were not. So I'm wondering if this is a long-term problem, but it's oppressing boys, even with drugs. And maybe that's part of the drug problem we have with boys as well.
Yeah. So I think the problem of Ritalin is a complicated one. There are kids for whom it's a lifesaver and who really need it. It is also, and Christina said this, I think, in her book, because I remember talking with her at the time, it is both overdiagnosed and underdiagnosed. So there are still some boys who really need it and could profit by it who don't get it, and there are boys who are getting, and girls, who are getting it who don't need it and probably shouldn't get it at all. It's a tough problem, but it is also, I think, connected to the feminization of the educational establishment, so that it has come to be seen as somehow a toxic environment if you let boys blow off steam and run around and act like boys and say bang bang you're dead and do the things that boys like to do. And there's so much resistance to that. There's so much fear that if you, I'll give you a story. When my boys were little, I let them dress up as Power Rangers, which in that time was the big thing, the silly cartoon on television. Anyway, superhero kids. All right. So many of the very enlightened liberal neighbors and friends of ours thought it was just scandalous to let children pretend to be Power Rangers because this was violent. And, sorry?
Fighting.
Yeah, fighting and violence and aggression and so on. And, I said, look, first of all, the children believe that they are the good guys battling evil. I think that's something we want to instill in boys. Second, boys have a lot of natural aggression. I'm sorry to tell you, they do. And they need to get it out in a positive and socially acceptable way. And it's not going to work to say, oh, we don't have guns in our house. Oh, we don't allow the boys to play that way. I think some of the more successful programs are schools specifically that are single sex for boys. There's one in our neck of the woods, it's called Landon, where, first of all, they take those kids outside like 3 times a day. It's just get them outside, run off that excess energy, and then they can focus better when it comes to sitting down and working. They don't eschew competition. They use competition in a way that boys enjoy and that spurs them to excellence. There's a tremendous emphasis in our schools on cooperative learning and so forth, which doesn't make boys' engines run. It just doesn't. And so I just think that we need to be more realistic about human nature. That doesn't mean accepting aggression or accepting boys behaving in antisocial ways. No, it means acknowledging that the aggression is there and it has to be channeled in a positive direction.
What effect do you see, or do you think we'll see, from the pendulum swing from the liberation of the sexual revolution to like the hyper-regulation of male-female relationship in the Me Too era?
You can come to tonight's lecture where I'm going to talk about Me Too. I do think that the Me Too movement is a reaction against the sexual revolution. That is the spoiler alert for tonight. But the attempt to regulate it is so awkward and so unnatural that it can't possibly work. Affirmative consent for every stage of the romantic process is just clunky and crazy in my view, and we need some broader returns to things like parietal rules, and and it's funny because there's this tremendous coalescence between some radical feminists and some radical conservatives who both agree that there need to be rules and that it cannot be our society's default assumption that men are entitled to sex from women. And that's going to take some doing to unwind.
I think it's pretty obvious that the majority of the issue is cultural, as far as criminal behavior, men being locked up, things like that. What do you think, though, is the role of criminal justice reform, insofar as you've got nonviolent offenders
when they get out, the recidivism rate is so high because they're unable to find work, forced back into a black market underground kind of lifestyle. Where do you see CJR coming into play to trying to reverse that problem?
CJR?
Criminal justice.
Oh.
Sorry.
So this is not an area that I've studied that closely, but I will say that I was very interested in the work of a University of Pennsylvania law professor. It's a Greek name, which I can't remember right now. I think he was just appointed to the Second Circuit or the Third Circuit as an appeals court judge. Really interesting scholar and legal mind, where he did talk about certain kinds of reforms that we need to think about. And one of them was moving prisons closer to where the families of prisoners live. That it is so difficult to visit people who are imprisoned, and it causes them to be even more cut off from the outside world than is strictly necessary. And I thought that was an interesting insight. And then there are, it's tough because an employer worried about liability looks at someone and says, well, you've done time. How can I hire you without risking getting a lawsuit if this person commits another crime? At the same time, competing against that, you have the idea that once you have paid your debt to society, shouldn't we be able to tell people that you can start fresh and that you don't have to return to a life of crime? That's a really tough balance, and there are some interesting ideas out there about how to navigate that, but as I say, I haven't studied it that closely.
Recently encountered a white couple in their late 20s, started a second. They were both divorced. One of them had children. They got a child, and the welfare benefits persuaded them to stay unmarried because she could get coverage for the delivery and post-birth
Yeah.
stuff. So what does the data tell us about that situation?
Yeah, there are a number of things in the law that actually discourage men from marrying the women they're involved with, and that's one of them. Is that your eligibility for TANF, which they now call it, is less if you're actually married. So that needs to change. I think a system more like wage subsidies makes much more sense. You encourage work, and you reward work, but you don't reward idleness. So.
Does the data tell us how big a problem that is with the government benefits to single mothers interfering with marriage?
Well, it's like a marble cake. It's very hard to tease apart which is affecting which. Yes, the availability of these programs does enable, there's always talk about people who enable alcoholics or drug abusers. The government enables people who are making bad choices about their child rearing by supporting them. But at the same time, it's hard to see how a benevolent society is going to actually say, well, sorry, you're going to have to fend for yourself. Especially in an era when churches are declining in influence. It used to be the churches would help take care of people in that situation. That's less true now. And then, of course, you have all the cultural pressures that are pushing people toward these decisions. It's important, I think, to recognize that the cultural messages are the problem, not the individuals who make bad choices. So the individuals are responding to what's out there. I talked with a young woman, beautiful young girl from the inner city, very smart, but she said nobody had ever told her that you were supposed to get married before having children. She said they thought of marriage as something that was sort of like the capstone of your life, like after you're all established and after you've had a great career and so forth, then you get married if you're really in love. But nobody gave her the message that, no, it's really important to start out with that, otherwise you may not reach those other goals.
Yes. Well, first I wanted to say I appreciate everything you had to say. I
Oh,
really
thanks.
loved it. So one question I had was, being a young person, I think that not only just social media, but media in general plays a huge role into people's lives, specifically young people because they have more access to it now. one issue that I see is a lot of media outlets sending messages that marriage, family, and things of that nature are not imperative to success in life. So how do you think we should, as a society, combat that? And then also, another thing I wanted to mention is I think, with you just saying that that a lot of people aren't necessarily taught that, I can relate to that a lot. And I think that the feminist movement has played a role in that, because even like my parents never got married, and it wasn't something that was a known thing. But even now with the feminist movement, it's even less communicated that you need a partner in
Yeah.
your life. So
No, it's true. I think feminism has a lot to answer for, because they were and are very hostile to marriage, and they think that it harms women. But in point of fact, the women who are doing best in our society are the college-educated cohort who tend overwhelmingly to be married. Not only do they tend to get married before they have children, they also have much lower rates of divorce than people with less education. So those, tell all those married doctors, lawyers, CEOs, business people, female, that they're suffering in their marriages, that this is something that's holding them back. I mean, quite the contrary. Not only is it good for them, it's good for their husbands, and it's good for their children, obviously. No, the feminists have made a terrible mistake about that. I mean, they were right about some things. I'm not saying the feminist movement did no benefit, it had no benefits for society, but they were disastrously wrong about family life. And it's very important when they continue to say this to call them out and say, have you looked at the evidence? Have you looked at the happiness surveys in this country that show that married people, both male and female, are way happier than single, divorced, or widowed adults? Have you looked at the income statistics? Married people accumulate more wealth and get more charity, I shouldn't say charity, but they get more help from extended family than non-married people. All of these things make sense, and yet they somehow never get discussed when the feminists are having their sort of autonomous fantasy that they can do everything and be everything and not pay a price for it, and not have their children pay a price. And what I was trying to say just today is they need to be particularly aware that if they decide to raise a child without a father, that boy, the girl may turn out okay, maybe not. The boy is almost certainly going to have a lot of problems.
To what degree, if any, do you think that the Great Society programs may have contributed to this?
Oh yeah, the Great Society did. Again, it's not 100% terrible. They did some good things. But most people think that Medicare was a good idea. I'm not so sure myself, but no, it did have a tendency. Again, these things are all connected. The cultural changes were happening. The government changes happened too at the same time. Hard to say, tease it apart and say what caused what. But the willingness of the state to come in and provide care does a number of things, and one of them is it gives poor incentives to people. And second, it robs those closest to you of their critical functions. And that's a more subtle but more damaging effect, right? I mean, if you don't have to take care of your parents anymore, your aged parents, because the government is taking care of them, then you may feel like, well, this is great, I love this, but it may not actually be best for you. Having a sense of responsibility and care for those around you is kind of the stuff of life. And that's part of what makes life worth living, is being needed and caring for others. And so these things can have a corrosive effect when the government takes over too many of the functions of families and civil society.
Sexual revolution, reduced church attendance, increased welfare state, increased eligibility for disability benefits, reduced manufacturing. Those are all cultural developments applicable to both sexes. Why is it that there's a particular pathology among men rather
So, a couple things. One, women are more resilient. That there's a lot of scientific data that show that. I saw one evolutionary psychologist describe it as nature takes risks with the male. So, if you look at bell curves of distributions of traits for men and women, you find, and this is all over the world. This isn't cultural. You find that women tend to cluster more toward the center, and men, so they have a taller, steeper bell curve, and men tend to have a shallower, wider bell curve. What does that mean? It means men are more likely to be at the top end of certain kinds of traits, good and bad, brilliance in math being one of them, and they're also more likely to be at the bottom end, having learning disabilities and mental retardation and a lot of other things. Well, so women are a little bit more resilient. But the other thing that there's great research on now, and I have to give credit to Tom Edsall of the New York Times, who has paid a lot of attention to this research in his New York Times column. There's a lot of evidence that the way fathers parent boys has a demonstrable effect on boys' ability to self-regulate. And as we know, self-regulation is probably the hottest issue right now. You know, there are all of these people who talk about grit and talk about persistence and talk about all of these traits that you need to be successful. There's a whole program at University of Pennsylvania devoted to figuring out, if they can, how to teach grit. And what they have noticed is that there is something about the father-child relationship that helps boys in particular develop grit, persistence, and the ability to self-regulate, the ability to put off gratification, the ability to control their aggression. When men roughhouse with their boys, which they do just naturally, it's like nobody has to teach fathers to do this, it just comes naturally, they do it. Well, it turns out if little boys don't get that roughhousing, they have a lot more trouble with aggression later in life. And so that's the picture that's emerging. I'm not saying this is dispositive, but I find it very interesting that we have these problems of boys not thriving at the same time and in the same populations where we have large numbers of female-only families.
Before we close today, I'd like to ask Professor Taylor to just let us know one more time what's happening this evening with Congress.
Yes, the 2019 John W. Pope lecture is called Me Too, A Sexual Revolt. I'm trying to make that with a question mark in there, and it's in SAS 2203 at 6 p.m.
All right, thank you. Well, Charen, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks.